Welcome back, everyone, to Echoes of Ihsan. You know how much we love to go deep on this show, and today we're diving headfirst into a topic some might find a bit, well, sensitive.
Sensitive.
Yeah, maybe a little. We're looking at divorce as viewed through the lens of Sahih Bukhari, specifically Book 63.
A fascinating choice. I think listeners might be surprised by just how much these hadiths reveal not only about the legalities of divorce in early Islamic society,
Or
but
look at relationships in general.
exactly, it's
Right.
a window into social dynamics, cultural norms, you name it. We're not just talking about dry legal pronouncements here, but real people.
Like real messy human situations, right?
Yeah.
The kind of stuff we can all relate to even centuries later.
Absolutely. You see how these situations, these dilemmas people faced actually shaped Islamic jurisprudence? Take, for instance, the issue of divorce during a woman's menstruation.
Oh yeah, there were multiple hadiths about that, weren't there?
Multiple indeed. And they offer some really crucial insights. The story of Abdullah ibn Umar is a great example. He divorced his wife during her period.
He did,
Yeah,
seriously.
he did, and it caused quite a stir. His own father, Umar ibn al-Khattab, a prominent companion of the Prophet, questioned the validity of the divorce.
Wow, so this was a big deal even back then.
It was. So naturally, the matter was brought before the Prophet Muhammad himself for clarification.
I bet that was a tense meeting.
Well, the Prophet addressed the situation head on. He instructed Ibn Umar to take his wife back, emphasizing that divorce during menstruation was not permissible.
Okay, so he laid down the law, but I'm guessing it wasn't just a simple, no, you can't do that sort of thing, right?
You're right. It gets more interesting than that. The Prophet outlined a very specific procedure to be followed, even if divorce was ultimately intended. It wasn't arbitrary. There was a wisdom behind it.
Okay, let's hear it. What was this procedure?
So Ibn Umar was told to let his wife complete her menstrual cycle, then to wait for another cycle to end, and only then, if he was still determined to proceed, he could issue the divorce, but before resuming intimate relations.
So there's this built-in waiting period.
Exactly. And that's crucial. It wasn't just about ticking boxes or going through motions. It was about ensuring a period of reflection, a separation.
A cooling off period, you might say.
Precisely. It emphasizes the gravity of divorce, discourages acting impulsively, especially when emotions might be running high. Remember, this was a time long before we understood the hormonal fluctuations women experience.
That makes so much sense. So this one specific case ended up having a ripple effect on Islamic law.
Absolutely. You can trace a direct line from this real-life dilemma to the legal principles that are still upheld today. It's quite remarkable how these personal experiences shaped broader understandings.
Yeah, it really brings history to life. Makes you wonder what else we can learn from these cases.
Well, for starters, they can challenge our assumptions. For example, when we talk about consent in relationships today, we tend to think of it as a modern concept.
Right, like something that's only recently become important.
But these hadiths show that even back then, consent, particularly in marriage, was highly valued. We have stories of women who actually refused to marry the Prophet himself.
Wait, they said no to the Prophet. That's bold. Tell me more about these women.
Well, there were two, both named Umayma. Their stories are truly fascinating. In one case, the daughter of Al-Jan was brought to the Prophet as his potential bride,
Okay.
and she very directly stated, "I seek refuge in Allah from you."
Wow, that's a powerful statement. So how did the Prophet react?
He immediately acknowledged her right to refuse. He simply said, "You have sought refuge with the great, return to your family." No pressure, no arguments. He respected her decision.
That's pretty incredible considering the social norms of that time.
Right. And then there's the story of the second Umayma. She was from the tribe of Bani Jan, and her reaction when the Prophet proposed was a little different. She said something along the lines of, "Can a princess give herself in marriage to an ordinary man?"
Interesting. It makes you wonder if she was truly concerned about status or just trying to find a polite way to decline.
It does. Maybe a bit of both. The Prophet, sensing her hesitation, tried to reassure her. He explained that his position was unique, that he had a special relationship with God.
But despite that, she still ultimately sought refuge in Allah.
She did, and the Prophet honored her choice. It highlights that even he, who Muslims consider to be the ideal example, understood the importance of free will.
Especially when it came to marriage.
Exactly. He didn't impose his will on others. It's a powerful lesson in respecting individual choices and recognizing that even the most revered figures had to navigate complex social situations.
Yeah, it makes them seem more human, more relatable.
And it shows us that consent wasn't just a modern invention, it was something they grappled with even back then.
Which makes you think, how did they deal with situations where things weren't so clear-cut, where there were accusations and uncertainty. These hadiths must have some insights into that, right?
They do. And the practice of lion is a prime example. It deals with a situation that, unfortunately, transcends time. Accusations of adultery.
Ooh, okay, that's a tough one. What is this lien? Some kind of ancient legal term.
It is. And it offered a way to address these accusations when there wasn't clear-cut evidence.
I'm intrigued. So how did it work?
Imagine a scenario where a husband suspects his wife of adultery, but he doesn't have the 4 witnesses required under Islamic law to prove it. What do? That's where lien came in.
So it's like a last resort, a way to resolve the situation when there was no other option.
You could say that. It involved both the husband and wife standing before Allah and swearing solemn oaths. The husband would swear 4 times that he was telling the truth about his accusation, and the wife would swear 4 times that he was lying.
Wow, that's intense. So they were basically invoking God's judgment, putting their fate in his hands.
Exactly. It was a profoundly spiritual process, and after this exchange of oaths, the marriage would be dissolved, regardless of whether the accusation was actually true.
So it was a way to bring closure to a potentially explosive situation, even without absolute proof.
Precisely. It highlighted that even in the absence of concrete evidence, there was still a mechanism for addressing such serious allegations and ensuring that justice, in some form, was served.
But think about the people involved. Weren't they terrified of lying under oath and facing divine consequences?
Absolutely. It wasn't just about earthly justice, it was about accountability before Allah. The stakes were incredibly high, both in this life and the next.
That's heavy stuff. So do we have any stories that show us how this lien played out in real life?
We do. And they're full of those twists and turns that make history so fascinating. One story that really stands out is that of Uwaymir al-Ajlani. It gives us a glimpse into how lien actually worked in practice.
Uwaymir al-Ajlani. Okay, I don't recognize that name. What's his story?
Picture this. You're living in Medina, back in the Prophet's time, and you come across a situation where a man finds someone else with his wife. What do?
Ooh, that's tricky. You'd probably want to avoid getting involved.
Exactly. But that's the question that was weighing on Uwaymir's mind.
So he went to the Prophet for advice.
Not directly, no. First, he approached another companion, Asim bin Adi, with this delicate question.
Makes sense. Not something you just bring up casually.
Right. Well, Asim, realizing the gravity of the situation, took the question straight to the Prophet.
Okay, now it's getting good.
Yeah.
How did the Prophet respond?
Initially, he found the question, well, a bit distasteful, almost as if it implied a lack of trust in one's spouse. Remember, building a strong moral society was paramount.
That's understandable.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing Uwaymir didn't just drop it.
He did not. He was persistent. He went directly to the Prophet himself and posed the same question again.
Talk about not taking no for an answer. So did the Prophet finally give him some guidance?
He did. It was in response to Uwaymir's persistence that the procedure of lien was revealed. It's as if this real-life dilemma prompted the need for a clear legal framework to address these kinds of accusations.
Wow, so Uwaymir was basically the catalyst for formalizing this whole process. That's pretty amazing. What happened to Uwaymir after that?
Well, he performed the lien with his wife, but then he decided to divorce her anyway.
He did. Why? I thought lien was supposed to settle the matter.
It did legally, but for Uwaymir, it was a matter of conscience. He felt that continuing to live with her after making such a serious accusation would essentially make him a liar in the eyes of God.
Whoa, that's a serious moral dilemma. He was caught between the legal outcome and his own personal convictions.
It really highlights the spiritual weight of the whole thing. It wasn't just about earthly justice. It was about seeking alignment with divine principles.
These stories are so insightful. They really humanize these figures from history.
They do, and they raise all sorts of questions that are still relevant today. We've talked about women refusing marriage proposals, but what about situations where a woman wanted to initiate a divorce? Did they have that right?
That's a great question. It's easy to assume that in a patriarchal society, women wouldn't have had much say in those matters. But these hadiths might surprise us.
They might. One particularly compelling story is that of Thabit bin Qais's wife. She wasn't unhappy with her husband's character or his faith. She sought divorce because she feared becoming ungrateful to Allah for the blessings in her life.
That's incredibly profound. Like, she felt that staying in a marriage she wasn't fully invested in would be a form of hypocrisy.
Exactly. And it challenges the stereotype that divorce was only initiated by men or due to some wrongdoing. Her reasons were deeply personal and spiritual.
So did the Prophet grant her the divorce?
He did, acknowledging her sincere desire for separation, but he did stipulate that she return the garden she received as a dowry.
Interesting. So even though she had the right to initiate the divorce, there were still financial implications to consider.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of financial independence, even back then. Divorce wasn't just about ending a relationship. It involved practical considerations regarding property and settlements.
It's fascinating how we see echoes of these ancient practices in our modern legal systems.
You're absolutely right. The division of assets, alimony payments, it all stems from recognizing that divorce has both emotional and financial consequences.
This deep dive is really changing my perspective on history. It's not just about dates and names. It's about people's lives, their beliefs, their struggles.
Exactly. And these hadiths offer a window into how they navigated those struggles, particularly within the context of marriage and divorce. And one concept that's central to that navigation is iddah, the waiting period after a marriage ends, either through divorce or death.
Ida. I've heard the term, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Well, think of it as a period of transition. It was a time for the woman to emotionally process the separation, but it also served practical purposes, like confirming whether she was pregnant.
Right. To establish paternity, especially in a time before modern pregnancy tests.
Exactly. But it was more than just a biological precaution. It was about giving the woman space and time to heal, to adjust to her new circumstances.
So it acknowledged the emotional weight of ending a marriage.
Precisely. And the hadiths offer specific guidelines for how long this waiting period should last, depending on the starvation. For example, a woman divorced by her husband would observe iddah for 3 menstrual cycles.
3 cycles, okay. What about widows? Was it the same for them?
It was longer for widows, 4 months and 10 days. This difference likely reflects the greater vulnerability widows often faced, both socially and economically. The extended period might have offered them some protection and support during a difficult transition.
That makes a lot of sense. It shows a sensitivity to the different challenges women might face after the end of a marriage.
It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. The duration of iddah could vary, reflecting a degree of flexibility within the broader framework. And speaking of flexibility, these texts are full of situations where the rules were adapted to fit individual circumstances.
Like real-life situations challenging the norms, right?
Exactly. These weren't just abstract legal pronouncements. They were applied to real people grappling with real challenges. And the story of Subaya al-Islamiyah is a perfect example of this adaptability.
Subaya al-Islami. Okay, I'm ready for another story. What made her situation so unique?
Subaya was a widow who was pregnant when her husband passed away. She was eager to remarry, but there was some debate about when her iddah would actually end.
I can see where the confusion would come in. Should it be after the standard 3 cycles or upon the birth of the child?
Exactly. It was a real dilemma. So she sought guidance from the Prophet, and recognizing the unusual circumstances, he ruled that she could remarry after giving birth, even though the typical 3 cycles hadn't passed.
So compassion and common sense prevailed over a strict interpretation of the rules. It's reassuring to know that there was room for flexibility.
It shows that Islamic jurisprudence, while grounded in clear principles, was meant to be adaptable, compassionate.
Makes sense. What other cases illustrate this kind of nuance?
Well, the story of Rifa al-Qurazi's wife is another one that comes to mind. It delves into some pretty complex territory.
Lay it on me. What happened with Rifa al-Qurazi's wife?
So, after being irrevocably divorced by Rifa, this woman married another man, Abdurrahman. However, Abdurrahman turned out to be impotent.
Oh, wow. So the marriage couldn't be consummated.
Exactly. This presented a difficult situation. Could she return to her first husband, Rifa, since the second marriage hadn't been physically completed?
I can only imagine how tough it must have been for her to even bring this up and seek guidance.
It shows the trust they had in the Prophet's wisdom. And in this case, he ruled that she couldn't return to Rifa until the marriage with Abdurrahman was actually consummated.
So he upheld the validity of the second marriage, even with this incredibly personal challenge.
Precisely. It highlights the significance of sexual fulfillment within marriage. The ruling suggests that, in this understanding, a marriage wasn't considered truly complete without it.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack. It really makes you think about how deeply they considered all these different aspects of marriage.
It wasn't just about legalities, it was about the physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions.
It's like we're piecing together this intricate puzzle, uncovering all these different facets of their lives, their legal systems, their social customs, their understanding of relationships.
And as we continue exploring Book 63, these themes keep weaving together, painting an even richer picture of this era. It really is remarkable how these hadiths offer such a personal perspective on history, almost like we're eavesdropping on these conversations from centuries ago.
Yeah, and it's not just about laws and rules, it's about real people, facing real dilemmas, making tough choices. Their stories give us a glimpse into a world that's so different from ours, but in some ways,
In some ways, still very much the same.
exactly. And one thing that keeps striking me is this emphasis on balance. Like, there are these clear guidelines, but also this recognition that life is messy. Things aren't always black and white.
That's such a key point. And that balance is beautifully illustrated in the story of Barira, a woman who was enslaved but later freed. Her case raises some really interesting questions about marriage, divorce, and even social status in early Islam.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more about Barira. What makes her story stand out?
Well, for starters, she was married to a man named Mudith who was also enslaved. But after Barira gained her freedom, she chose to separate from him.
So even though they were both enslaved, she still exercised her right to end the marriage.
She did. And it suggests that even within the constraints of slavery, women weren't completely without rights or a voice in these crucial matters.
That's pretty powerful. What was the reaction to her decision?
It's said that Mudith was heartbroken, absolutely devastated. He followed her through the streets of Medina, weeping openly. It was such a public display of emotion that it even caught the Prophet's attention.
Oh, wow. So how did the Prophet respond to this?
He turned to his uncle Abbas and remarked, "Are you not astonished at the love of Mugith for Barira and the hatred of Barira for Mugith?"
It's a very human observation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, even he was struck by the raw emotion of the situation.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The Prophet then asked Barira directly, "Why don't you return to him?"
So it sounds like he was trying to intervene, maybe encourage reconciliation?
It seems so, but Barira's response is crucial. She asked, "Oh, Allah's apostle, do you order me to do so?"
As if to clarify if this was a command or just a suggestion?
Precisely. The Prophet made it clear he was simply interceding on Mugith's behalf, not issuing an order. And Barira, in turn, stated firmly, "I am not in need of him."
Wow. She stood her ground. Her freedom, both literally and in terms of choosing her own path, was clearly non-negotiable.
It's a testament to the importance of free will, especially for women who often faced immense social pressures. Barira's choice reminds us that autonomy and self-determination were valued even back then.
Barira's story also brings up this concept called wala. I have to admit I'm not familiar with that term. What does it mean in this context?
Wala is a complex concept. Think of it as encompassing the rights and obligations associated with someone who has freed a slave. In Barira's case, Aisha, the Prophet's wife, wanted to purchase and free her.
Okay, that makes sense.
But her master stipulated that the wala should remain with them, meaning they would still retain certain rights over her, even though she was technically free.
That seems a bit unfair. So what happened?
Aisha brought the matter to the Prophet's attention, and he clarified that the wala belonged to the one who grants freedom, not the former masters.
That's a significant distinction. It really shifts the power dynamic, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It affirms the freed person's autonomy, severing ties with their former enslavers. It demonstrates how Islam gradually challenged existing social hierarchies.
We've talked a lot about marriage and divorce, but these hadiths also address how Islam navigated its relationship with other faiths and cultures.
Right. For instance, there's a hadith where the Prophet prohibits profiting from the sale of dogs and earnings of a soothsayer. These prohibitions offer insights into the cultural landscape.
Now that you mention it, dogs were considered impure in some cultures, weren't they? And soothsaying would have been associated with beliefs that went against Islamic teachings.
Exactly. So these prohibitions were partly about setting boundaries, distinguishing Islamic practices from others. It was about forging a unique identity while existing in a diverse society.
I see. Drawing a line, but still acknowledging the presence of other viewpoints?
Precisely. There's also a hadith narrated by Nafi about interfaith marriage. Ibn Umar, when asked about marrying a Christian or Jewish woman, stated that Allah had forbidden believers from marrying women who ascribe partners to Allah.
Right, because the concept of God's oneness, tawhid, is fundamental to Islam. Marrying someone with different views on this would have been seen as incompatible.
Exactly. It shows how these teachings provided guidance on how to navigate a diverse world while upholding core beliefs.
It's fascinating how they address these everyday dilemmas, these intersections of faith and social interaction.
And as we wrap up our deep dive into Sahih Bukhari, Book 63, I think it's important to remember the historical context. These hadiths emerged during a time of significant change, the establishment of a new faith and a new social order.
So any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
What resonates with me most is the profound respect for human dignity woven through these teachings. Whether it's upholding a woman's right to choose, ensuring fairness in divorce, or setting ethical guidelines for social interaction, the emphasis is always on justice, compassion, and accountability.
And what I find so compelling is that these aren't just abstract ideas.
Mhm.
They're grounded in real-life stories, human
Mhm.
experiences that bring these principles to life.
Exactly. These stories invite us to think about the complexities of relationships, the challenges of social change, and the search for meaning and purpose, themes that are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
That's the beauty of studying these hadiths. They're not relics of the past. They're living sources of wisdom.
Couldn't agree more. As we conclude, I encourage everyone to keep reflecting on these teachings. Think about how they might enrich your understanding of relationships, faith, and the pursuit of a just and compassionate world.
And on that note, we wrap up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you next time as we continue exploring the boundless realms of knowledge at